Good morning, Poppy. Albus welcomed his resident healer into his office with a smile as he finished reading the letter he had received only minutes earlier. The guest knew to wait until Dumbledore had finished whatever he was doing before disturbing him. He was an important man and any mail he got this early in the morning was bound to be fittingly urgent, or so she reasoned. She was shocked, however, when the elderly man had finished the parchment with a serious look on his face before burning the letter and turning to her. "What can I do for you this morning, Poppy?" the headmaster asked, gaining his usual mirth by the end of his sentence to the relief of the stressed healer. "Sir, Gara woke up about an hour ago. You asked me to notify you." "Ah yes, I'd almost forgot about Mr. Gara," Dumbledore lied flawlessly, having thought of little else that night. In fact, the letter that he had received was from the ministry to notify him that no one of Gara's description or name had ever been recorded on any documentation in the magical or in the Muggle sector, ever. He had had the response mailed to him overnight using his considerable influence at the Ministry of Magic. They had checked and he wasn't even under the surveillance that all underage magical children were automatically added to. This was incredibly troubling for the Great Wizard as it meant that he had an unknown piece on his chessboard and he didn't know whether he was black or white under his coating of sand. Albus realized he had paused in his thoughts, so he followed up his previous statement with an inquiry, "How is he doing today, Poppy?" "Well, he's much better, and from what I could tell he seems to be healing incredibly quickly," the nurse witch looked happy at this revelation. Having discovered that many of the injuries from the night before had lessened or in some cases disappeared. She couldn't explain how it was happening other than to dismiss it as another one of the curiosities that seemed to surround her newest patient. "I talked to him briefly and he told me he fell off of a hippogriff in mid-flight. He also told me that he couldn't be healed because he was cursed." "Did he mention what curse?" Dumbledore was raptly paying attention, hoping to solve the puzzle that was Gara. "I'm afraid we didn't really talk, seeing as he's mute. But he did nod when I asked if it was a curse." "Thank you, Poppy." Albus smiled, silently processing the information for later. "Anything else?" "No, nothing, sir." "Very well, I will accompany you to the infirmary so I can have a talk with Gara as well." Waving his wand, the various scrolls on the ancient wooden desk started to pile themselves up or hide themselves in drawers and chests around the room as Dumbledore rose to his feet and walked behind his trusted medic to the hospital so that he might finally get some satisfactory answers. "Oh, and Albus," Poppy said as she walked through the corridor, "I found Mr. Potter and his two friends harassing Gara in the middle of the night. Probably woke the poor boy up." Dumbledore chuckled good-naturedly at the predictable antics of the Golden Trio. "Not to worry, Poppy. I'm sure Mr. Potter and his friends were just as curious as the rest of us as to who their new classmate is." Madame Pomfrey couldn't help but notice that, despite Albus' words, he was walking incredibly quickly towards her station of work. The nurse had a difficult time keeping up with her boss as he strode in haste, turning each corner as fast as he could. There was no real rush to get to Gara. As far as Dumbledore knew, he just had things on his mind that were driving him to worry. Dumbledore reached the infirmary doors a full 60 seconds before his trusted medical witch, though he decided not to announce his winning the silent foot race as it seemed a little childish, so he settled for eating another sherbet lemon as his prize. Huffing, Poppy arrived to see Albus eat another sweet before she moved past him in minor annoyance at his obviously childish antics and into her infirmary. Dumbledore followed silently, sucking on his sweet treat in bliss. The old man was less than surprised to find Gara in bed after he had been told of the seriousness of the injuries the young boy had sustained the night before. However, he would have been lying if he had claimed to have expected the short teen to be awake so soon. "Good morning, Gara," the bearded white-haired man said merrily as he approached the silently teen who regarded him with subtle caution. The redhead returned the greeting with a nod, pretty much all he was capable of at that point considering his muted voice and unwillingness to exercise his sand abilities for such a trivial response. "I'm glad to see you're up. You had us all worried." Gara nodded again. A silent thanks that was just as insincere as the concern in the professor's aged voice. "I have to get some potions from Severus. I trust you won't tire him out too much," Poppy said softly before leaving with a nod from Albus, who waved her off with a smile. "Gara, I was hoping that we could reprise our little chat from the other day," the elderly man said as he sat down on the closest chair. The bed-bound boy sighed silently as he readied himself for one of his least favorite games, question evasion, the game for grumpy shinobi. Not suitable for children under the age of 4. Batteries sold separately. Nonetheless, Gara slowly nodded his head in resignation to the fact. It could have been worse. Gara remembered his absolute least favorite game from when he was a child, Pin the Kunai on the Jinchuriki. "There have been some concerns raised regarding you, Mr. Gara. More specifically, your past. I realize now that I may have been hasty in my admittance of you into the school, considering I know next to nothing of your past. Truth be told, Albus didn't like lying. In fact, he hated lying outright, but when it came to protecting the school and the magical world, he didn't have a choice." Gara activated his sand and let it adopt its natural ball shape in the air, ready to answer any question posed, though how they were answered was still up to him. "Well, I suppose my first question should be, what is your surname?" "You never mentioned it before," Dumbledore said, listing off all of the things he wanted to know before the end of the morning. The sand formed the word Sabeka no Gara without delay. Dumbledore made note of the unusual prefix of no before the second name. "So Gara is your surname, and Sabeku is your first?" Shakes head. "Oh, I see. You say your name backwards," Albus stated, almost surprised considering the boy was speaking perfectly fluent and unaccented English, yet he had a foreign name and wrote it the other way around, surname before first. Gara wasn't too happy about being called backwards but ignored the distasteful comment in favor of concentrating on keeping his face empty and the ball floating, now that the words had dissolved. "So, I think my next question would be, where are you from?" Gara paused for an instant, thinking of a suitable half-truth to tell the intrusive person in front of him. When he had decided on the correct omissions, the words appeared in the air a sentence at a time. "I am from a desert village." That didn't answer his question. "What country are you from?" "We call it Wind Country." "What would foreigners call your country?" "I don't know." This was tiring, as far as the questioner was considered, but that did not deter him. "How did you get here?" "Professor Snape brought me here from Hogsmeade." "How did you get to Hogsmeade?" "There aren't any deserts near here." Dumbledore thought twice about his last statement when he recalled all the secret places within the wizarding world. "Are there?" "I was transported here." "From where?" "My home country." Albus, a man renowned around the wizarding world for his patience and willpower, was losing this battle. It seemed as he was taken around in circles. "All right. Next, do the other people in your country have the same abilities as you?" Albus needed to know how much of a threat Gara was and if there were others who could pose a similar threat. As much care went into the answer as the question as Gara tried to think of the correct answer. Either way he might be harmed. If he claimed no one else had his ability to manipulate sand, they might consider him less of a threat and attack him, but on the other hand, if he said others had the power, they might attack him from fear of his race. It was difficult, until he came up with the perfect answer. "The truth. Our abilities vary." "I see. Do your people know you are here?" "They might be worried." Dumbledore needed this question answered more than any other, as this would determine the boy's threat level besides the startling power he had shown previously. Gara's reaction said it all and still didn't answer the question. It chilled the headmaster down to the bone, just as it had anyone else who was to see it. Gara smiled. "Probably. Who's to say?" "Gara, how exactly do you move your sand? I haven't seen you touch your wand since you entered the school," And Lupin tells me that you didn't even have one until you had been taken to Ollivander's before term started. Gara held back another smirk at how untrained even one so old and experienced as the principal could be, that he didn't even notice that Gara had been fiddling with the wand under his sleeve ever since he had received it. It was nothing short of incompetence. I don't need a wand to move my sand. That's very impressive, Dumbledore said, smiling. I also need to ask about what Professor Trelawney said yesterday, about you. Sorry. I don't know anything about what she said. Do you? Gara was telling a half-truth, as he could guess about a few of the basic references within the prophecy, but the overall meaning was still unclear. Dumbledore was truly impressed at this point, as he knew he was being taken for a ride by the clever boy before him. It's sad to say that none of us knows what it meant. One last thing, Mr. Gara. Could you refrain from carrying your gourd with you to classes from now on? The teachers don't think it's appropriate. Dumbledore said this with a hint of apprehension, due to the question having an obvious answer that he himself knew would be negative. No. It protects me. It was about the reaction Albus had expected. Well, this has been enlightening. Thank you very much. I'm glad we could get to know each other a little better, Gara. Albus smiled, and the boy sitting across from him noticed the twinkle in his eye start up like a flashlight reflected back at him. Gara suddenly got the same feeling he had gotten when the irritating hat had tried to read his mind the night before. The old man wasn't surprised when even a well-versed legilimens like himself couldn't penetrate the boy's mind, though he didn't put too much force behind his mental attack, as he would never forget the Sorting Hat's reaction to whatever was inside of Gara's mind. Stay out of my mind. The sand formed these words, surprising the recipient, as he had rarely, if ever, been caught snooping through someone's mind before. My apologies. It's an old habit of mine. Dumbledore stood up, hating how much his knees hurt because of the weather, and nodded his head in further insincere apology. I'm afraid I have to be getting back to my work now, Albus stated, standing before Gara. Before I go, would you like a sherbet lemon? After a final head shake, Gara was left alone in the infirmary again as the headmaster walked out. It was a true pleasure to be alone sometimes. Gara couldn't help but admit this to himself as he sat back in the bed, regretting, if only slightly, that he had passed up the sweet from the professor. Gara sighed as he unconsciously fiddled with his wand, glad to have been left with it instead of having it confiscated like his clothes seemed to have been. Gara didn't ever, in his wildest demon-fueled nightmares, imagine that he would ever be so bored that he would fondly reminisce about the times he played Catch the Monster. In his infinite and unending boredom, Gara noticed that he had been thinking about a lot of the horrifying games he played as a child. Though, even the villagers didn't call them games, they were deadly serious in their desire to kill him. Gara had begun calling them games through his crippling loneliness and unfulfilled wishes to play or even be with others for the briefest moment. Though, that had ended when he started playing games with the villagers, inspired by Mother. Still, back to the current problem, Gara was starved for interest in the dull and empty hospital wing. It irked him that, out of the last 5 days he had been in Hogwarts School for Witchcraft and Wizardry, supposedly a place of wonder and awe, he had spent the last 4 days in the hospital wing on bed rest. He had tried to leave once or twice, but even his amazing shinobi skills couldn't evade the eagle-eyed Madame Pomfrey, who, despite her age and lack of formal training, could keep up with best of shinobi. And thus, the red-haired ninja of the sand was stuck in the most boring section of the apparently wondrous school for magicians. All visitors had been turned away, most being curious irritants called students and a few actually being concerned classmates. In a whole different category were the trio of Gryffindors who seemed determined to get the answers they craved despite the detention they had received and the hefty amount of house points they had been docked. The only other person who had tried to visit Gara that he knew of was Draco Malfoy. He had also been turned away as Gara was still deemed too injured to receive visitors, no matter how much Gara himself denied this fact. As far as the tanuki-eyed boy was concerned, if he could walk, he was healed. Real shinobi didn't complain or stay in hospital with an almost mended broken leg and now only bruised arm. They got up and fought. The only solace Gaara had was that his clothes had been returned to him, literally as good as new, the day before. However, on strict orders of the nurse, he was to remain in his hospital gown until he was released. On the 5th day, he had been told that he was almost ready to be discharged and that he would be allowed out on the next day, which, he noticed, happened to be a Saturday. Later that Friday night, the first visitor was admitted to see Gaara, mostly through blackmail and threats. From what Gaara could hear, Draco had threatened to send an owl to his father and have the nurse fired. Whilst Madame Pomfrey knew that even Lucius Malfoy couldn't have her fired, nor would Albus allow her to be harmed, she did respect the fact that the usually cold and distant Malfoy, who would often show nothing but malice to those he called friends, was now trying his hardest to see his newest acquaintance in their sickbed. Poppy was not as cold-hearted as some of the others in the school, as she only saw a frail boy who had been hurt a lot in his life and needed help. It had been one of the largest reasons that she had been so insistent that the new student spend the majority of his first week in her care, as she could clearly see that not only were his unhealed injuries severe, but his previous ones were as well. He had numerous scars all over his body, not befitting a child of his age, and she couldn't stand to see him suffer anymore. Gaara was actually pleased to see his sole peer acquaintance before him that night, having prayed to see just about anyone to alleviate his boredom, just short of Konoha's green beast. Draco took the chair next to Gaara's bed and moved it to the end so he could look directly at his peer, not willing to sit next to him like a commoner. "I've tried to visit before but the stupid nurse wouldn't let me in. I swear, this is almost as bad as letting that bloody oaf teach care of magical creatures," Draco said, riling himself up with just the thought. "I talked to my father and he said that he would have that idiot locked up. If he hadn't made you ride that bloody chicken, you wouldn't have fallen. And if it weren't for you, I might have lost my arm." As much as Gaara disliked this form of communication, he decided it was necessary until he thought of a better one. The sand was already in a ball by the time Draco had noticed it was moving at all, and as he watched, the sand morphed into individual shapes. It wasn't his fault. "Do not blame the groundskeeper." "What are you talking about?" "It was clearly his fault, by the time my father..." Draco trailed off, as he looked up at the new message written in sand. "Placing blame is weak." Draco opened and closed his mouth in fury. Being called weak was beyond ridiculous. He was the son of one of the most powerful men in the wizarding world. How could he be weak? The strong fight their own battles and never place blame, except with those who rightfully deserve it. This shut Malfoy up completely for a minute or two. Draco had never been told anything like this ever before. Sure, he had been called a wimp and a coward by Potter and his gang, but that was just them trying to insult him, wasn't it? The inner tribulations continued until he broke his own train of thought with his latest mocking point for his nemesis. "I don't suppose you've heard, but that serial killer was spotted by Hogsmeade a few miles away," Draco began, and already Gaara was getting a bad feeling. "Yeah, Sirius Black's probably here to finish his job and kill Potter. Can't blame him." Gaara grimaced, and almost face-palmed, at the thought that Sirius had been spotted. Served him right, always going out for runs when he wasn't even hunting. It was only a matter of time. "But that's not the weirdest thing," the Malfoy heir continued. "Crabbe and Goyle have both been avoiding me all week. Ever since they were let out of the hospital wing they've been acting terrified of me and won't come near me." If Gaara wasn't mistaken, he could swear he heard a little hurt in the platinum blonde's voice. The two conversed, albeit mostly one-sidedly, for the better part of an hour before the visitor was ushered out quite forcibly so that Gaara could have his last meal and sleep in the infirmary. The last thing that they had talked about still echoed within both their minds long into the night due to the possible implications it held. Gara had asked Draco, quite humbly in all of its written glory, if Draco could teach him the basics of spell casting. Draco had been stunned that someone so clearly strong in so many ways would need help in basic magic. Gara had explained half-heartedly that he had never used a wand before, having never needed to. Draco, still internally claiming to have no interest in such trivial matters as friendships, accepted the request under the pretense that it was merely because someone of his stature couldn't been seen to be alone all of the time, and since his trusted goons had deserted him he needed a new companion. Draco had offered his weekend to help Gara train, having felt quite privileged, not a feeling he was unaccustomed to aid the boy who was clearly going to be a great wizard in no time. A perfect ally and a great example of his own abilities, to have taught a great wizard. Gara almost felt a sense of joy as he fell into his most deeply enjoyed state, at the thought that when he awoke he would be free of the gatekeeper of the 8th circle of hell, which had kept him in a perpetual state of boredom and half-death for the past week. Some might have claimed him to be melodramatic, but he was a being who thrived on activity, having grown up as a warrior. It also didn't help that no matter how much he denied it, Gara was influenced by the demon inside of him, only subtly but surely, and Shikaka cried out for mischief. Freedom, glorious freedom. Gara literally ran out of the infirmary after he had been told he was allowed to leave, after he bowed to the woman who had cared for him. On his way out, after dressing, he strapped the sand back onto his back where it rightfully belonged before reforming his sand armor that had apparently been chiseled off of his body the night he had been admitted. The high-level shinobi had a little difficulty running with the sand weighing him down due to the healed broken bone. His leg, whilst almost completely fixed, was still sore and tender from its recent breakage, so he was a little unsteady on his feet. As soon as he had exited, he went straight to his room to find Draco. No matter how early in the morning it was, though it just happened to be just after 6 in the morning, Gara was enough of a hard-working ninja that he wasn't opposed to training near dawn. It was a new habit, the whole training thing, but it seemed to help that guy with the bushy eyebrows, so he decided that he would train until he was recognized, like him. Draco, having had a long and boring first week back, had committed himself to a full morning's worth of sleep and relaxation, followed by an hour or two of teaching Gara how to use his wand in the evening. Draco was rich and privileged, used to a life of luxury, and he loved every second of it. Gara arrived back at the entrance of the Slytherin common room and stumbled across his first problem, the need to speak the password to gain entry. Gara considered, briefly, the prospect of tunneling through the entrance or one of the walls to get in, but decided against it as it would expose his sleeping quarters for any intruder to just walk in. So, fighting his boredom once again, which had become a skill by this point, Gara stood outside in the cold of the underbelly of the school for the next hour and a half, before one of the more studious teenagers had risen to get some breakfast on the first Saturday of the school year. The poor lad had almost fainted when he left his common room in the morning, expecting to see a handful of the other early risers out and about, only to find the scary new student, who had since been named Sabeko no Gara, standing outside of the entrance of the Slytherin dorm in waiting. It was scary, and Gara didn't care as he walked past the frozen teen into the moderately warmer room to find his temporary sensei. Draco hated many things: mudbloods, Potter, Weasleys, Dumbledore, Potter, divination, Hagrid, Potter, Crabbe and Goyle as of the past week, and Potter. But out of all of those insurmountable evils, the one thing Draco hated above all others was definitely being woken up early on his Saturday. When he was shaken, lightly, awake, he considered cursing the ghastly monster who would steal his precious time. But when he saw the ghastly monster, now identified as the recently released Gara, he quickly decided against cursing the boy who was looking at him with something akin to disdain, if one was able to determine any emotional shift from the stoic face. "What?" Draco said, not quite awake enough to put in place the proper etiquette required when talking with peers due to his tired state. "Go back to sleep if Pomfrey kicked you out of the hospital wing," commanded the Malfoy, as he turned over. Gara was not impressed to find someone whom he had respected. Of all of the wizards he'd met, sleeping in so late and acting so grumpily in the morning, especially for a civilian, it wasn't as if he had to do any real work during the week. Gara assumed it would take a lot more to wake up the grouchy teen, so he uncorked his sand and sent a tendril to sweep the young wizard off of his bed and onto the floor. That woke him up. "What is it that you need so early in the morning?" Draco had regained some of his proper composure after he swept himself off of the floor and wiped the sleep from his eyes, realizing that he wouldn't be going back to sleep if the boy with the gourd had anything to do with it. Gara held up his wand and gave it a flick to gesture his desire to learn and practice its use. This earned a shocked and exasperated open-mouthed look from Draco, who had assumed Gara couldn't find his way to the dining room, or some other relatively normal problem, though still not enough of a good reason to wake him up. To find out that the new student wanted to start leaning so early was like a ton of bricks falling on his head. Make that 2 tons considering Draco agreed to tutor the boy in the first place. "But it's 7:30 in the morning." Draco whined as he attempted futilely to get back into his warm and comfy bed, only to be pushed back onto his feet by the same sand tendril that he would curse until the day he died. Or woke up fully. Gara gave him an even look before throwing Draco's clothes at him, the latter having laid them out next to his bed the night before so he would have even less work to do on his most holy of days. Grumbling to himself the entire time, Draco dressed while Gara considered whether or not he would need his throwing knives and exploding tags. A quick look back to Draco, who had just fallen over in the process of entering his trousers, confirmed his sufficiency with just the wand and his ever-present sand. 20 minutes after entering the room, Gara left with the slouching Draco following soon after at a slower pace. By the time they had reached the gigantic front door of the castle, Draco was walking in his usual snobbish way. The only sign of his discontent was the dark circles around his eyes and the almost silent mumblings to himself of how much he hated being awake. As they walked, some of the Gara fan club, which had been watching the doors of the infirmary for the past week in hopes of seeing the release of their idol, were shocked to see Gara and Draco walk right past them. Each night they were ushered away at curfew, and each morning they would return anew until they had to get to a class. The few that were just making their way to the Great Hall for breakfast were amazed to see not only Gara out and about, but Draco sporting the new must-have look, raccoon eyes. Pretty soon everyone would be using eyeliner to achieve the insomniac look. Draco didn't appreciate all of the looks and giggles he got as he made his way out of the castle and onto the grounds. He could have sworn he heard someone laugh at his eyes. It wasn't his fault he had bags under his eyes. He was tired. What he didn't hear was that they were talking about how even the great and mighty Draco was following Gara. The noble Slytherin had asked Gara if they could go and have breakfast first, but the other had shook his head and carried on. As far as Draco was concerned, this was not shaping up to be a good day. Tired, hungry and mocked, he was certainly having a terrible Saturday. Still, he supposed he would get to see a prodigy learn to use his wand. They arrived at a secluded grassy area soon after leaving the gates of the castle. Having trekked a little further than usual to avoid any prying eyes, Draco stood in front of Gara and decided to start with what the obviously gifted exchange student knew. "So, if I'm going to teach you, I need to know what you already know," Draco said, waiting to hear about all the advanced spells the boy knew and what basic ones he had overlooked. Gara shrugged his shoulder, probably for the first time in his life. Draco gaped. It took a few minutes to regain full brain function after that startling confession. He had to be sure. "Are you saying you don't know anything about spell casting?" The incredulity in the older boy's voice was as obvious as his bright hair. Gara nodded his head, feeling their first warning signs of embarrassment coming on. "Well, I guess we'll have to start with some of the most basic spells. Wait, how are you not able to use magic yet? You come from a purer blood family." Again Gara shrugged, which he imagined would be a time saver for the future. "Never mind," Draco said, not fully believing what he was being told, but knowing that saying anything wouldn't do him any good. In any case, one of the first spells we learnt here was the floating charm. Draco took out his wand and gestured for Gara to do the same. "Now repeat after me, Wingardium Leviosa," Draco said before catching his mistake and looking Gara, who looked back at him evenly, trying to hide his humor as he waited for his tutor to catch his mistake and realize that he couldn't speak, much less copy his words. "Sorry. I guess you'll just have to use non-verbal magic. Just imagine the words in your head and copy the wand movements. It takes greater control and a lot more skill, but that shouldn't be a problem for you. So, imagine the words Wingardium Leviosa and at the same time, swish and flick your wand like this." Wingardium Leviosa, Draco demonstrated on a rock lying on the ground, levitating it into the air before his face before dropping the spell, sending it plummeting back down to earth. Gara watched with avid fascination at the simple trick, and then looked at his jet black wand. Swish and flick, Gara practiced the motion before focusing his intent on a rock the size of Hagrid's head a few feet away. Wingardium Leviosa, he thought to himself as he focused a small amount of chakra into the wand. Swish and flick. The rock started to rise a foot or so in the air, Draco looking on in awe as the heavy object was lifted without even the smallest sign of strain from the caster. The boulder was at eye level and Gara hadn't even blinked in exertion. However, the rock started to shake precariously, at which point Draco thought that even holding it so long was admirable. But soon after the shaking started, there was an almighty explosion as the rock blew up right in their faces. Fortunately, like always, the sand shield protected Gara automatically, only needing a little extra chakra to extend its protection to his friend. "Why the bloody hell did you do that?" screamed Draco, checking himself over for splinters and fragments of stone. Another shrug was Gara's honest answer, as he had done exactly what he had been told. He turned to his left and lifted his wand again, aiming for a rock further away this time and supplying as little chakra as he could. He repeated the spell and the effect was as violent as before. "Are you sure you're saying the right spell in your head?" Draco asked, looked almost accusingly at his pupil, who looked a little sheepish even when he nodded. It wasn't like Gara to act sheepish, but the entire experience of spell casting had been humbling, even if it was only the 2 instances. "Okay, maybe we should try something a little easier," the platinum blonde said, trying to think of the simplest spell he knew. The problem was, he couldn't think of anything simpler than the floating charm. Even near squibs like Longbottom could cast it. "Aha!" cried Draco. The finger that had been resting on his chin was now pointing into the air in triumph. "Try the Lumos spell," Draco said in happiness. Whilst the spell was a 3rd-year level, it was remarkably easy to perform and required very little magic to get at least a small glimmer of light. Draco demonstrated, saying that Gara should put as much magic as he could into the magic to see what his power level was. Gara, not seeing any problem with gauging the level of his magic, copied the motion and forced his vast amounts of chakra into the strong black wood. Both of the teens had expected a similar or smaller ball of light than Draco's, Gara assuming that one needed more chakra to perform a spell than a jutsu. The outcome was unexpected. The ball of light was blindingly white, like a sun at the end of his wand that starkly contrasted the black of the wand itself. The flash didn't last long, having been cancelled by Gara's lack of concentration when he went to shield his eyes. "What the hell are you doing?" Draco was absolutely fuming at the problems he was facing. "How did you do that with a simple Lumos spell?" The fact that Gara's light spell was so bright wasn't the issue. Most wizards could perform one that luminous, but to do so during the day with the sun high in the sky was beyond imagining. This time, put as little power as you can into it. The lesson wore on all day and stopped only when the hunger-driven stomach cramps became too much for the young purer blood. So much for his perfect Saturday. The next day followed much the same pattern, with Draco trying desperately to teach Gara to control his magic and power down his spells, that seemed far too powerful for an untrained wizard. By the end of the second day, With so much blood and sweat put into it, the Malfoy child was close to tears of happiness when Gara was able to levitate a small rock without blowing it up for the first time. The rock hit the ground, however, when the Tanuki host's attention was drawn to the crowd of people, standing all around them at quite a distance, started clapping and cheering at their, supposedly private, achievement. Now, Gara was no stranger to the odd compliment or crowd of fans every once in a while, ever since the Konoha vs. Sinnoh conflict, but when he saw one characteristic in many of the observers, he started to run, hoping that Draco would follow. The terrifying characteristic, shared by many people within the audience, were a pair of drawn-on black rings around their eyes, similar to the ones Gara was born with, though he would always vehemently deny that he was born with the raccoon look, in favor of the insomniac excuse. He would not stand idle as the swarm of Fang Earls descended upon him and his teacher, friend, so he ran for his life and for his sanity. When they finally came to a stop, safe within the confines of the Slytherin dorms, Draco panted heavily before asking, who were they? Deeming this a serious enough question to answer, Gara wrote out one word, simple enough, in sand, Fang Earls. Enough said. That night, Draco slept like a baby, hoping beyond hope that he would be able to sleep past 7 o'clock next weekend. Gara, on the other hand, was hoping that none of his lessons would call on him to do any high-caliber spells for a while, at least until he was able to control his power better. The next morning was a slow Monday start, everyone trying to get out of bed before they were swallowed by their covers and forced to stay in all day, which, as tempting as a day in bed sounded, was unlikely to please their irritable head of house, who had been in an extra bad mood this year. The roommates with hairs as red as blood and as bright as the sun were just as slow to rise as everybody else. Draco, being the normal teenager he was, no matter how much he denied, he couldn't find the exit to his bed no matter how hard he looked. And Gara was sure he'd forgotten how to stand up, but wasn't willing to test his theory for another hour or so. Eventually, after another 10 minutes of refusing to accept the reality that they would be getting up, both did rise to the occasion when they realized that the lesson they would be late for, permitting they had stuck with the original plan of skiving, would be potions with Professor Snape. It wasn't like Gara was afraid of the man, as he had pretty much proven he could defend himself against the man's spells, but he did respect that the man was his teacher for the time being and wasn't willing to show that much disrespect, especially when he had covered the potions lab with slime the week before. Breakfast was an uneventful meal, being that everyone involved was either too tired or studious to bother anybody else at that time in the morning. As they ate breakfast, Gara saw Remus Lupin enter the back entrance to the Great Hall looking as sickly and pale as ever, which he could sympathize with. However, he had some business with the acquaintance that couldn't wait much longer. He waited patiently for Remus' eyes to look at him, during the teacher's surveillance of the Great Hall, at which time he gestured for Lupin to meet him outside with a stiff head nod. Outside of the hall, Lupin looked around as he exited the giant wooden doors, finding the boy he was looking for in one of the many nooks the castle had, the perfect place for secret meeting of a less than reputable nature. "Good morning, Gara. I'm glad to see you're doing well. I wanted to come and see you in the hospital but I wasn't in the best health myself." Lupin looked ashamed by his neglect of his obligations, which Gara thought was an overreaction but didn't dwell on something so insignificant. "What is Sirius doing?" Gara's hand had zoomed out before the older of the two had even noticed. It was amazing how easily people in the wizarding world adapted to change despite their apparently ancient customs. "I imagine you are referring to the sighting a few days ago." Lupin suddenly looked even more tired at the thought of their mutual friend's antics. "I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet but I assume he was merely bored. Always was an impulsive person. Caused unimaginable trouble for the four of us." Gara tuned out again as the tales of the stories about Lupin's childhood sprang up. When Lupin had finished explaining something about a stink bomb, fanged frisbee and an unfortunately placed family heirloom, Gara turned back in and asked his next question, "When can I see him?" There is a trip to Hogsmeade coming up soon, you can use it for cover and meet up with him then. You're going to have to sneak out of the castle, though, as you don't have your permission slip signed," the man said, looking thoughtful. He had to think of which passage for Gara to take that would be the least risky. The Humping Willow route seemed a little risky for the boy, him being so small and frail-looking. On the other hand, he was more than proficient with his sand, and he had heard rumors that the boy had seriously powerful magic as well, if only a little unrefined. A few teachers had started to watch Gara's lessons along with the students after the numerous explosions the day before. "The passage you should take is out by Mr. Gara. I do believe you're going to be late for my class, you'd better get going," Snape interrupted with a haughty look of derision that seemed as commonplace on his face as the look of illness of Remus. "And Remus, are you determined to corrupt an already detestable child? You," he turned to Gara with nothing less than pure contempt, "get to lesson before I give you enough detentions that by the time you leave you'll, at least, be the same height as a 6-year-old. Gara, in no mood to stay and listen to more ranting from the hateable man, walked calmly away, calling his sand back into its proper resting place. "You'd better be getting to your class too, Remus," Severus sneered. His triumphant look of superiority over the secret werewolf was cut down to size when he noticed Lupin looking elsewhere. The man leaned out into the hallway, past Snape's bewildered face, and called out to the retreating guard back of Gara, "See you later, Lily." Lupin then walked off without even looking at Severus' enraged face, and on to his first class of the day. First years. Too easy. Class went better than the week before, Gara managing to stay until the end of the lesson this time without destroying anything larger than a cauldron and a cauldron-sized section of a desk. Though, if Snape seemed irritable before his encounter with his old-school rival, he was utterly ferocious after. Fortunately, the rest of the day was more agreeable to all those involved after the unpleasant potions class. Even care of magical creatures was a happier experience for Gara, though it would have been difficult for him to have had a worse time in the class considering the precedents set last week. They observed a herd of unicorns, which seemed a little too fond of Gara for his liking, as they relentlessly followed him around despite his silent protests and urges to use deadly force on them. The next day was worse than the day before, but still much better than almost dying from falling hundreds of feet onto the forest floor and hitting every tree branch on the way down. Gara had to work through a third-year charms class with no magical talent and far too much raw power. Suffice to say that he was averaging one classroom destroyed per week so far this term. "Can anybody tell me what is inside of this wardrobe?" Lupin asked his third-year defense against the dark arts class. "It's a Boggart, sir," Hermione Granger piped up, surprising several students with her sudden unexpected presence there. "And can anybody tell me what a Boggart looks like?" The natural teacher again questioned his students as he looked at the faces around the room. Potter, check. Malfoy, check. Weasley, check. Granger, check. Lily, check. And check. All of the key players were there and ready. They were vital as they were all important to him in one way or another, if only by association. The week before had just been introductions to the class and the syllabus, so this week was the first real test of his teaching ability. Nobody knows what a Boggart looks like, as they assume the form of whatever the person closest to them fears the most. Again, Granger answered, reciting her perfect knowledge of most academia flawlessly. "Correct," Lupin announced, pleased that there was some base knowledge floating around in the pool of young minds. "There is a very simple way to defeat a Boggart." Laughter. The lesson continued as the Slytherins listened as raptly as everyone else, only when they heard they would be facing one of the monsters themselves. Gara was genuinely interested about what some of his so-called peers were most deeply afraid of, himself included. As well as Gara thought he knew himself, he honestly couldn't tell what his greatest fear would be, though he had a big sand monster hunch as to what it could be. Gara's thoughts were disturbed by the gramophone starting up, with a jazzy tune that sent the students into a rhythm as they lined up and began to face their fears, cast the ridiculous spell and laughed the monster into submission, ready for the next person. Guy was standing behind Draco and in front of a handful of Gryffindors, which he was silently thankful for as he was actually looking forward to facing the one-tailed beast, and he knew that if Harry Potter were to have his go first, then a certain infamous Dark Lord might appear and that would just ruin the lesson for the rest of the class. Next up was Draco, who looked nervous, which was turned into terror when the Boggart turned into the one person he feared the most, his father. The tall and strict-looking man wore sharp robes and held an even sharper cane, scowling at Draco the whole time. Soon enough the man was walking quickly forwards, towards a stunned Draco. The son was so afraid that he couldn't bring himself to raise his wand against his father, even when the father raised his cane, ready to strike him around the face. Gara surveyed the room and found half the class afraid, Slytherins, and half the class with looks of hatred, the Gryffindors. It seemed Boggarts were nothing if not informative. "Draco, you know the spell," Lupin said encouragingly, ready to step in if necessary. Ridiculous, the defending boy stammered, still not able to pull off the charm. Gara, deciding he wasn't willing to see his friends further hit his friend in the face with the cane, no matter how funny it may have been, pushed past the quivering teen to face his fear and beat the sand out of it. The Boggart shivered before jumping into the air and started to spasm and shift before him. The shape that was left over after the change landed back on the floor surprisingly softly, making black-rimmed eyes widen. Gara's mouth opened and the slightest whisper met the ears of others around the room, indiscriminate to merely a whimper at the sight of. To be continued.
Well, that's the ending of that chapter. I do hope you enjoy this video. If you like to see more, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment down below. Until next time.